right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get this kicked off. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another exciting edition of Comparative Religions. This is my friend Josh, and he is
Joshua.
Joshua. I'm sorry.
Long form.
Yeah. Joshua, and we are primarily Facebook friends. So it's a wonderful world when you can have close friends that you've never met face to face, right? Like. And so we talk on Facebook often and are in a lot of the same circles on the Facebook groups that you guys have never heard of because you just aren't interested, right? Nerdy theology majors and stuff like that. So, but Joshua is just one of those guys that, like, he should just get a PhD right now. They should just give him one just because of all he knows. He's really just one of the smartest people I've ever had the privilege of talking to. And since we're going to be talking about indigenous religions in Africa, and since he is serving in Africa, I'd much rather him talk to you about indigenous religions in Africa than have me talk to you about indigenous religions in Africa. So like I said, he's serving in Kenya. He's fluent in, I don't even know how many languages. How many languages do you know, Joshua? Sorry.
Fluency is a high bar.
Sure.
I claim fluency in 4 dialects of English, and 3 of those are Southern. However, I can get by in Sempur, the language of the Samburu people. I have preached a 45-minute sermon without notes, without preparation on a 5-minute notice in the Ma language of the Maasai people. I'm mistaken for fluency in Swahili, but that's just because I have a really good accent and I use the proper formal greetings instead of just saying, the equivalent of, how are you and your family doing this day, instead of just, hey, yeah. So they think that I know more than I do. I frequently correspond in Swahili and French, but I don't do well with spoken or listening French because it goes way too fast for my slow Southern ears. So I've got the biblical Greek and Hebrew. In grad school, I had some Syriac and Latin, which is mostly but not entirely forgotten. I've written poetry in the Khasi language of Northeast India, where I spent time in 1995 and 1998. I have preached on Daniel, actually, in the Tok Pisin language of Papua New Guinea. Several years ago, but I've mostly forgotten that one as well by now.
All right.
I used to be able to recite the Lord's Prayer in Afrikaans.
Nice. Yeah, nice. So I'd say he's qualified, right? This is the kind of person that you want to listen to. So Joshua, take it away, man. Go for it.
Aya, kati nanu Joshua ole Barron. Kito biko nano tinebo esiankiki ai, esiankiki na tupa. On kera ang bukira ile, tinkop akini elaran tumono ongwan. Pole, elaran tumono imiet. Kekwet rashat. Oh, sorry. You might be a missionary if you sometimes forget which language you're supposed to be speaking in. That's something that actually happens pretty frequently. So I'll translate what I just said. It was a typical Maasai greeting. Basically, I'm called Joshua Barron. I've lived myself together with my wife who is absolutely excellent, together with our children, all 6 of them, in the land of Kenya for 14 years. Oh, stink. Wait a minute. I mean, 15 years. Time really flies. So I want to start by a little bit of overview, some 3 key points about African traditional religion. I might abbreviate that as ATR, which could either be Africa traditional religion or African traditional religions. Then I will proceed to talk a little bit specifically about how things are among some of the Nilotic peoples like the Maasai and Samburu of East Africa, primarily Kenya and Tanzania. And then I'll move to a brief, broad overview of African traditional religions in general. And most of that will be more relevant to the Bantu cultural, ethnic, linguistic groups rather than the Nilotic groups. The Maasai and Samburu, Turkana are all Nilotic groups. And then hopefully there will be time for questions. As somebody with a lot of experience in teaching, I really like when students ask questions because it gives me the illusion that you all have been paying attention. And I recognize that sometimes that is only an illusion, but there you go. So the most important thing to learn about African traditional religion is that the African worldview is holistic. And I'll talk more about this in a bit. And as a result, you can't separate talking about religion on the one hand from talking about culture or social issues or customs on the other hand. Now, in most Western cultures, and certainly in America, we have a dichotomy between the sacred and the secular, or you might say between the spiritual and the scientific, as well as between the private and public spheres. Religious matters, of course, are considered by many to be private affairs in America and in much of Western Europe. And this is why in America, this is part of why the First Amendment to our U.S. Constitution both prevents the federal government from establishing a state religion on the one hand, or from prohibiting the free exercise of religion. It's because religion is something private, and so it's considered to be beyond the purview of governmental concern. But in African context, things are quite different. Africans intuitively know that these Western dichotomies that we don't even think about because it's just in the air that we breathe and the water we drink, Africans instinctively know that these dichotomies are false dichotomies. Africans very easily see things holistically. Thus, they live in a much larger world. Most Americans live in an itty-bitty small world. I mean, yes, we have our interstates and we can drive for 24 hours at a time without leaving the borders of our country because it's a big land. But in our worldview, things are often quite small. We don't have an expectation for the miraculous. We certainly don't have an expectation for our ancestors to have any real importance for us today, in spite of what the New Testament, may have to say about there being a great cloud of witnesses around us. But the African world is a much larger world. There's room for the unseen spiritual as well as the seen physical. And there is an acknowledgement that the spiritual and the physical interact with each other and affect each other. There's room also for both the living and the dead. And this is why in most African contexts, the ancestors are very important. I don't know of a single Bantu group for whom the ancestors are not important. However, in Nilotic groups, sometimes when you die and that's it. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on as well.
Joshua, can you explain briefly Nilotic and Bantu?
Oh yeah. So there are many different linguistic, families in the world, and they're usually associated with different ethnic groupings. So, for example, in Europe, we have the Romance languages, Italian and French and Romanian and Spanish and Portuguese and a few others that aren't as widely spoken, that ultimately come from the Roman Latin colonization during the period of the Roman Empire. And then you have Germanic languages, which include obviously German, Dutch, English. And historically, different ethnic groups spoke languages belonging to, these different languages. And so in Africa, you also have different language families. The two in sub-Saharan Africa, the largest language family is the Bantu family, and it's like Indo-European. Indo-European is a big umbrella, which includes Greek, Latin, all of the Germanic languages, and so forth. You have the Semitic family of languages, which include Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Arabic, and various Asian families related to Mandarin, Chinese, and so forth. You have the Sanskritic families in North and Central India. And in Africa, Bantu is the largest umbrella of culture and language and ethnic groupings. One of the, I'm not sure if that would be the second or the third largest group demographically, top four anyway, are the Nilotic peoples. The Nilotic peoples originated along the Nile River Valley in what's now North Sudan and South Sudan. And, some of them have migrated over the centuries as far south as, into southern Tanzania. They're mostly Tanzania and Kenya, Uganda, and North and South Sudan, although some of them have gone further afield. Their languages are related to ancient Nubian, which the Nubian was an ancient area in what's now North and South Sudan and South Sudan, where Christianity had a glorious history of 1,000 years before finally disappearing into the sand. And so this is the same culture family, language family as those group of people. Our work has mostly been among the Maasai, Turkana, and Samburu peoples. We speak the Ma language of the Maasai and the Sempur language of the Samburu people. 300 years ago, the Samburu and the different Maasai sub-tribes were like the 12 tribes of Israel together, but because they live far apart now, the languages have diverged a little bit. So it's kind of like Spanish and Italian. If you know one, you can mostly get by in the other, but sometimes we'll say something funny by mistake. So is that good enough, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And so we've been in Africa so long that there's some things that everybody just knows that everybody doesn't just know. So both Ryan and also your students, feel free to throw up a hand and call out if you need to stop me at any point. So the most important thing is that African worldview is holistic. The second most important thing to learn about African traditional religions, or ATRs, is that ATR, like African cultures, are not monolithic. And so we can make broad generalizations, just as we can for Euro-American cultures. But these generalizations will be more accurate in some contexts and less accurate in other contexts. Africa is, after all, not a country, but a rather large and diverse continent. So the third thing, perhaps, that's the most important to learn is that traditional African culture and religion has not embraced the radical and atomized individual autonomy that's common in the West and is maybe even sacred to our sense of Americanness. Several years ago, and Ryan at least will remember this well, then First Lady Hillary Clinton wrote a book entitled "It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Children Teach Us," which came out in 1996 while her husband was still president. Now, as you might expect, the book "It Takes a Village" was widely praised on the progressive political left, and it was widely panned and scorned on the conservative political right. Mostly, in both cases, by people who hadn't actually read the book. But here's the thing. The assertion of the title, "It Takes a Village," was simply intuitive to the African American community, regardless of one's political persuasions, whether they voted Democrat or Republican or Libertarian. The idea that it takes a village, African Americans said, "I'm so glad a white person has finally figured this out. We've always known that." This is also intuitively true to Africans on the African continent. And again, setting aside Mrs. Clinton's political commitments, just consider with me the title, "It Takes a Village." Obviously, this is not the radical, rugged individualism that most white Americans grow up with and see praised in our movies and television shows and in our novels. But in most African contexts, this is just an observable fact. It takes a village. You can't go it alone. That's not going to work out for you. The keystone of much of Western philosophy in the modern period comes from the famous first principle of René Descartes, who lived 1596 to 1650, cogito ergo sum. For those of you who haven't had Latin, in English that of course becomes "I think, therefore I am." Cogito ergo sum. While most Westerners will focus on the cognition or the intellectualization that's there, on the thinking, I want to point out that Descartes was speaking and thinking in the singular. I. Not we, not y'all, but I. In Africa, however, we have a different motto. Instead, we would say maybe we are, therefore I also am. Or I am because we are. This African philosophical worldview is known as Ubuntu. Some of you thought that Ubuntu was just a computer operating system. It's actually much bigger than that. A friend and colleague of mine, Stan Chu Ilo, a theologian from Nigeria, puts it like this. And now you'll forgive me for reading for a moment. Ubuntu is from the African language of Nguni in southern Africa, and it implies compassion, open-mindedness, and fraternity. It signifies our mutual involvement in each other's life. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirms others, does not feel threatened by others, and is open to doing good for others. Ubuntu is a rich expression of solidarity, participation, and willingness to share with others, to forgive others, and to mutually work together for human and cosmic flourishing through solidarity, community, dialogue, and commitment to peace building, and so forth. Now, while the term Ubuntu may be most common in Southern Africa, or an English discourse that has learned from Southern Africa, or among computer programmers, I suppose, the concept of Ubuntu is universally African, whether you're Bantu or Nilotic or whatever other grouping. When discussing concepts of life-affirming hospitality and compassion, Ubuntu, together with related terms, are very common in the Nguni languages. The Nguni is a family of Bantu languages in southern Africa, but also in the Bantu Twi languages of Western Africa, centered in Ghana. We see it in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria. We see words in Congo and Kenya and Tanzania where this idea is expressed. And I could give you examples from about a dozen languages, but I think maybe I shouldn't. The most famous definition of this Ubuntu worldview in English is that of Kenyan theologian John S. Mbiti, who lived from 1931 to 2019. and who once graciously gave me 30 minutes of his time face to face in 2018, the year before his death. But he wrote, this is how he explained this idea. He said, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. Now, because this is so common throughout sub-Saharan Africa, I want all of you in the room to repeat it after me. I am because we are.
Because we are.
And since we are, therefore I am.
Since we are, therefore I am.
So that is not really a part of American culture. That might feel kind of foreign to some of you, unless you've gotten really deeply into New Testament ideas of koinonia, of fellowship, of perichoresis, interpenetration relationally, whether that's between God, Father, and the Father, Son, and Spirit within the Trinity, or whether that's within relations between humans and God, or horizontally between humans. If you've really spent time exploring those Christian themes, this African idea will seem less foreign to you. If you've been primarily immersed in American culture, it will probably sound odd. But one thing we should immediately note, while African cultures are not at all identical to biblical cultures, they are much, much, much closer to biblical cultures than they are to our own Western post-Enlightenment cultures. And they are closer to biblical cultures than our post-Enlightenment cultures are to biblical cultures. And that's an important point to note and to keep in mind. Consequently, in my experience, African Christians often understand Scripture much more easily than we do, because it's simply not as the world of the Old Testament and the world of the New Testament just is not as foreign to most Africans as it is to most Western Europeans and to most North Americans. So there is so much stuff in the Old Testament that seems odd to us, that is just daily life for them. Hey, Ryan, you have pastoral experience, don't you, as well?
What do you mean?
Within churches, pastoral experience.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So, somebody might come to you with marriage issues sometimes, right?
Sure.
No big deal. We expect that's a universal thing.
Yeah.
Has anybody ever come to you over issues of polygamy?
No.
No. But you remember, who were Samuel's parents? Samuel's father was a bigamist.
Yeah.
And his inability to do that well created household turmoil within that polygamous family.
Yeah.
Between Hannah and Hannah's co-wife.
Right.
American English, we don't even have words like co-wife. Where I live, a co-wife is a thing. And it's something that pastorally you have to deal with sometimes. What do you do when a polygamous family comes to Christ and they're all baptized? Are you going to pick one wife to stay the wife and send all the other wives into a life of prostitution?
Right.
Or to a life of adultery? Or a life of destitution? American Christian theologians don't have answers for those questions.
Yeah. That's good.
Because they're not questions that we ask.
That's good.
And so when we do what we do here, we can't do it from the perspective of American culture, because that's someplace else. We have to do it from the perspective of the cultures that surrounds us. So now let me move into sharing a little bit about the traditional religion of the Nilotic Maasai and Samburu peoples, with whom we've worked the most closely. How much more time do we have, Ryan? I'm really bad at telling time.
Let's see, 2:45. So half an hour, 45 minutes. Yeah.
All right, very good. I can look at the
45
clock
minutes.
on my computer and keep track then.
Okay.
Time is something else that's different in Africa. Chronological time does not matter. Chirological time matters. Seasonal time matters here, and that's a part of the culture, and it also shows up in the religion as well. Well, let me turn to traditional Maasai and Samburu religion, and I want to start with sharing an anecdote. When the first more evangelical missionaries who actually had success among the Maasai, who were one of the most resistant people groups on the planet historically, in terms of being resistant to the gospel. When the first people to have success, they had success because they came in and they dressed like the Maasai, they ate and drank like the Maasai, they remained monogamous, unlike the Maasai. They learned the local language. They built houses out of sticks and mud. They lived just completely traditionally, and they were able to get a hearing. And so when they were first heard, and this story has been repeated in more than one area of both Kenya and Tanzania where the Maasai live. The missionaries were frequently told this. We once knew this. We once knew God that you're talking about. But our ancestors stopped telling the stories about God, and we forgot the stories. So we know about God. We know God created everything, but now God is kind of distant. That we don't really know anything about God. I mean, obviously, the mamas are really good at praying for rain and praying for babies, and whatnot. But we don't really know God. We kind of know a little bit about God, but God is distant. We used to know about God, but we forgot. And is very important throughout African cultures and religions. The supreme creator God is often distant. And among Bantu groups, you will maybe have these intermediary spirits or divinities or gods with a little g, with whom you'll deal with on a day-to-day basis, because the supreme creator God is too high and above. It's similar to the culture of late medieval, early modern China, where the people had would venerate their ancestors, and they would have these idol shrines where they would pray and worship and sacrifice, but they also retained the belief in the one high creator God, but the people weren't worthy to worship that God, the high Lord of heaven. The emperor only was worthy to do that, and he could only do it once a year. Once a year, he would worship and pray and sacrifice, to the one true Lord of heaven. But for the Chinese people, that wasn't really considered an option. Likewise, outside of Christianity, for the Maasai, there is a strong connection, and a personal connection to God, and that's not uncommon in Africa. So instead, you will resort to the Libones. Libone is the English pronunciation of Ilibonok, the diviners. Uncharitably, you might call them witch doctors. These are the people who will, examine the entrails of animals to find out what's going to happen in the future. They're also the people who are the ritual experts, who will help you do a proper blessing when you build a new house, or when you're transitioning from one stage of life to the next. They're also who you might go to curse somebody. So now I want to talk a little bit about curses and blessings. Curses and blessings are understood to be efficacious. Now, if you've read your Bible, you will give intellectual assent to this idea of blessings and curses having power. But in your day-to-day American life, that's probably not very much a part of your reality. Even if you're an average committed participating Christian, not just a pew sitter, it's just not part of daily American existence. But blessings and curses are assumed to be effectual, to be powerful. And this goes back, of course, to the holistic worldview that I've already talked about. Everything is interconnected. Now, with curses in Maasai culture, typically, you don't just curse out of vindictiveness, you curse when you've been wronged. And so your curse is a cry for God to bring justice. This finger is called Olodeket, the forefinger or the pointer finger. And Olodeket means the cursor. And so if you come and visit us, don't ever point like this at anybody, because they will think you are cursing them. And so if you have to, normally if you point, you would point with your lips, which is odd until you get used to it. If you must use your hand, you use all of your fingers together to point, not just the one. And then a curse is conditional. May all this bad stuff happen to you until you make restitution for the wrong that you have done, until you are brought to repentance. So the idea of a curse in Maasai religion is that it's a last ditch effort to bring a wrongdoer into a right relationship with his or her community. Unless, of course, it's a curse from a witch or a sorcerer, and those are just kind of more vindictive. And so if one of those people points at you with one finger, even if they don't say anything, you can expect your dog or your wife or your son to die, or something else equally bad. I mentioned with the anecdote about the Maasai saying we lost the stories about God, except the women still really pray well. The Maasai word, general word for woman, is inkitok. The plural is inkituak. You ladies will want to know that etymologically, kitok is an adjective that means great. So inkitok, woman, means literally the great one. So you can be a little encouraged by that. And you guys can, maybe stop having a big head if that's an issue for you. But inkitok can mean either woman or wife. And it is, interchangeable in translation. But if a wife has had a child, she's still inkitok, but she's also now called intamanoni, or the plural is intamanonok. And an intamoni literally is one who has prayed well. And the proof that she has prayed well, the baby at her breast. And so women are understood to have a closer, to have a greater spiritual sensitivity, and more easily have a close connection with God. And in the Christian worldview, we're all definitely Pharisees rather than Sadducees. We're into the resurrection. We completely believe that. And in most Bantu cultures, the ancestors are very important, the living dead who are still connected to our reality. But for the Maasai, when you're dead, you're dead. A funeral service means you carry the body out on the plain after dark and abandon it so that by morning the hyenas will have eaten the corpse. And so I have a beautiful story. There's a Christian, a Maasai Christian mama, in her 40s or 50s. So I wouldn't think she's old, but you all probably would think she was old. And she'd been baptized. She'd been a Christian for a while, but there were a lot of things she just hadn't really got. She'd gotten that Jesus was good for the here and now, but one Sunday, through the scripture reading, she realized that Christ had conquered death and that death is not the end. And she was so overwhelmed by that prospect that she just broke down sobbing with tears of joy, and as mixed with pent-up grief that had been unexpressed for those who had preceded her in death. And she wept for just like 20 minutes before she could speak. And when she was able to speak, the thing that she said would translate into English as, "I now know that death is not the end." So it was a hugely transformative moment for that particular individual. Ryan knows that one of my favorite people in the world, my mentor, who passed away at the age of 93 on our anniversary last August, Andrew Walls. Andrew Walls has noted that the starting point of African Christian theology is this: God has a vernacular name. That is a name in the local language. We don't have to call God by Deus, the Latin word for God, or Theos, the Greek word for God, or Elohim, the Hebrew word for God. We can use the English word God. It's very convenient for us. But this is also true for the many different language and culture groups, ethnic groups in Africa as well. But these various vernacular names for God do two things. Number one, they tell us something of a people's understanding or conception of the nature of God. But two, they also reveal actual aspects of God's character that maybe those of us who only speak English, may have missed. And I want to share a few of those with you. The Maasai word for God is Inkai. The plural, Inkayatin, is never ever used. It only appears in Bible translations where it's translating, the pagan gods, small g, because they can't conceive of there being more than just Inkai, just the one. But Inkai has a homophone that means rain. So sometimes Inkai means God, and sometimes it means moderate to heavy rains. And you can actually say, Kesha and Kai, God is raining rain. Because there's this intimate connection between the blessing of rain and God. God sends the rain. And remember, the Maasai and the Samburu, they're a semi-nomadic people. They're pastoralists. They depend on their livestock. They're semi-migratory. They go to where the rains are and where the grasses are good. And if there's no rain, there's drought. The cows die. There's no milk to feed your babies. The people start to die. It's a famine. And so the very name of God invokes the blessing of rain. One of the names for God in Maasai, the Ma language, is Nom Peace, which means, the one of the growing grasses. Another one that will throw some of you for a loop. In English, it's a big deal whether you want to refer to God as, if you want to say God himself, God herself, God Godself. I like to say God Godself and avoid debates about, gendered pronouns in English. But if you refer to God as she, in a lot of American contexts, you will either have liberal, progressive, ultra feminist people get really excited, or you'll have conservative people get really, really angry. How dare you talk about a God? God is not a goddess. Here's the thing: in the Ma language, words have prefixes that are either masculine or feminine. The word for God, the ink at the beginning, ENK, is the feminine prefix. So what do you do with that? Their conception of God, there is no, if you put an OL in front of it, it has, which would be the masculine prefix, that's not a word and it has no meaning whatsoever. They have no problem considering, God as father, but if they're speaking English, they're going to use she rather than he to grammatically agree with the fact that the word God is feminine. Now, words for God are grammatically engendered in this way in many languages, but not in all languages. In Hebrew, El and Elohim are grammatically masculine. In Latin, Deus is masculine. In Greek, Theos is masculine, though in both Greek and in Latin, there's a feminine pair that we would translate as goddess. And in both the Greek New Testament and the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament, only the masculine form, Theos, is used to refer to the God of Israel. And of course, Jesus became incarnate as a human male. And so consequently, that and the fact that God has identified God's self as Father, we're used to saying He. But some have wrongly developed the idea that God is therefore ontologically male. The Maasai don't have this difficulty, just as ancient Christians did not have this difficulty. Gregory, one of the great Cappadocians, actually made fun of people who thought that because the word theos was grammatically masculine, that God was therefore male. He said, no, God is beyond either male or female, and yet the masculine and the feminine within the images of God that humans are equally reflect different feminine or masculine attributes of God. And so that's something that we've had to, come to terms in, even with how we use language when we're talking to the Maasai. Words for God for the Maasai include Nilotic, the beginner of the earth, Olatubarani, the maker or the creator, Olabani, the healer. One of my favorite Maasai worship songs is Olabaani, Olayorani, which means, one who heals, one who loves. And so all of those ideas resonate with what we know of God from the revelation of Scripture. And, the Maasai, keep sheep, goats, and cows for a living traditionally. They're shepherds. And one of the words for a shepherd or pastor, one who tends or cares, is Olamaratani, which is one way that God is addressed. And they might say, Nai, Olaramatani, which is, oh God, which is feminine, Olaramatani, which is masculine, and they have no difficulty using, masculine and feminine terminology at the same time for God. The Maasai see God as a guard or a watchman, which reminds me of where in the Old Testament God is called Shomer Yisrael, the guardian or the watcher of Israel. So those are I could really go on for this, because this is one of my favorite topics for probably an hour, but I better pause and move on. So those are just some of the Maasai concepts of God that actually can help us to more fully understand the revelation of God that we have in the New Testament and the Old Testament. And so now I want to turn briefly to ATR, African traditional religion generally. And most of what follows is more specific to Bantu groups, but it is again broadly applicable. If you want to understand African traditional religion, your understanding must include at least 4 dimensions. 1, the personal dimension. That is what religion means to individual believers and their expectations, feelings, and behavior. 2, the social culture dimension. That is the communal aspects of religion and what it means to both individuals and community. 3rd, the phenomenal dimension, the all-encompassing meaning of religion in terms of its beliefs, behavior, feelings, and practices, and all that means, to the religious practitioners and community. 4th, the supernatural dimension, how life revolves around and is totally integrated with the realm of spirits and the supernatural. And again, we have this holistic vision. African traditional religions also have 5 fundamental theological beliefs. Number 1, beliefs in impersonal, often mystical powers. 2, belief in spirit beings, both good and bad. 3, belief in divinities or gods with a small g. 4, belief in a supreme being or creator. And 5, belief in a hierarchy of spiritual beings and powers. And it's because of this hierarchy, you might feel a need to interact with these divinities, gods at the local idol shrine, or to consult the local diviner for assistance because you're just not worthy of notice of the supreme being. You're lower down in the hierarchy than that. There's also 5 basic categories of African traditional worldview. And the first is holism. That is a holistic way of seeing reality that I've already discussed. And thus, there are no clear boundaries between the physical and the spiritual dimensions of life. There's no clear distinction between secular and religious activities, between one's work and one's community responsibilities. As Kwame Bediako of Ghana puts it, humans live in a sacramental universe where there is no sharp dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual. The physical acts as a vehicle for spiritual power, while the physical realm is held to be patterned on the model of the spiritual world beyond. Thus, Western dualism is very difficult for Africans. And when missionaries when Western missionaries come to Africa and operate from within Western dualisms and Western dichotomies, they are creating stumbling blocks that prevent Africans from hearing the gospel. Africans long to long to live in a world that's not confused. Africans don't live in a world that's confused of non-integrated parts. Life is mysterious, but it's part of a whole. And that whole is governed by a law of harmony, the goal of which is to maintain a state of agreement of peacefulness. Now, this might, be a surface peacefulness. Why do my people say peace, peace when there is no peace? But at least an appearance of peacefulness. The traditional African seeks to live in harmony and to balance his or her life in a harmonious and peaceful existence with his or her entire world, and especially with the spirit world, which of course would include the ancestors. So the first aspect of African worldview is that it's holistic. The second is spiritualism. There's no distinction between the physical and spiritual worlds. They overlap. Third, dynamism. Because life is uncertain, because the spirit world is impersonal, unseen, and unpredictable, there is a desire for power that will bring security in a dangerous world. Africans have no use for a religion that offers a form of godliness, but which denies its power. And consequently, you will see ritual manipulation of the spirit world for power in the seen reality. and that becomes very important as well. Fourth in worldview, communalism, which is again this idea of Ubuntu, communal self-respect, interdependence, survival of the community, group assurance, cooperation and harmony, affiliation and shared duties. However, this emphasis on communalism can very frequently result in a denial of personal responsibility for one's own actions. Consequently, sometimes a theology of sin is a little bit weak in African context because there's not a sense of the individual responsibility. So American Christianity can offer to African culture the importance of individual responsibility and accountability. But at the same time, there's a whole lot that African cultures can offer to American cultures. And the fifth key point of African worldview is a sense of fatalism. And y'all are far enough along to know what that means, so I won't go further. And I'll pause so that there can be time for any questions or discussion.
Yeah.
Ryan knows that I could talk for 5 hours without a stop.
So earlier you mentioned that the African culture that you've experienced is more similar to the biblical culture than our Western culture is.
Yes, in 1,000 ways.
Yeah, and in the class last semester we learned about the difficulties of bridging the culture gap between the biblical era and our Western culture, and then the difficulty for a missionary to to bridge the Western culture to that of the place they're ministering to. So would you affirm that, or would you say it's been easier because the biblical culture is so similar to the African culture, or would you say it's been more difficult because you grew up and you were raised in the American culture?
I'm a little bit of a statistical outlier culturally, and my wife and I are really, really good at learning human cultures and human languages. I've had internships in Papua New Guinea in 93, 95, and 98. I was in Northeast India. We lived in South Africa 2000, 2001. We've been in Kenya for 15 years and interact with African church leaders from all over. And we're students of culture. So for us, we can, we're missionaries. So when we come back to America, we don't really fit in. But here's the thing, we didn't fit in very well before we left either. We were just a little bit odd. I was described as a college student as, barefoot, blanket wearing freak who will probably end up being a missionary. Not far wrong. So for me, because I can get inside of the African culture, it decreases the gap. There's a huge gap between contemporary African cultures and biblical culture and worldview. But it's a much smaller gap than the gap between African culture and post-Enlightenment Western culture. And it's a much smaller gap than the gap between biblical culture and our American culture. And so for me to help them, they have a much smaller gap because they understand polygamy. They understand being dependent upon the rain. They understand intertribal warfare and people coming and raiding and stealing your cows. They understand not having access to the miracles of modern medicine, and the importance of kinship, the importance of the father or the grandfather or the living great grandfather within the clan. Is part of their daily existence. So yeah, the gap for them is potentially smaller.
So would you say that the difficulties were mitigated somewhat in bridging that culture gap because they're so similar, or would you say it was still particularly difficult because you have your own culture and their culture is still somewhat significantly distant from that of the biblical culture?
there's a distance, but again, the distance is so much smaller that if you simply read the scripture aloud and occasionally just explain it simply in the local language, they often don't need the commentaries that we need to understand. We need these commentaries to understand the biblical background, but they still share a lot. I mean, key parts of their culture are the same as it was 2,000 years ago, and very akin to what it was in Israel. So their gap is quite small compared to ours, and so it's easier for them. Professionally, my calling has to do with being intercultural, and so being cross-cultural and being and entering somebody else's culture is literally what I do for a living. And so it's become second nature for me. But, would it have been second nature for me 30 years ago? No. But again, I've been at this for a long time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that helped.
Yes.
All right. So this is kind of, I guess, a question about the history of evangelism in Africa. So I know in the early patristic period, Alexandria was like one of the big cities that was part of Christian faith and stuff like that. And so I know that's at the northern part of Africa. So did evangelism ever spread further than that long ago? Has there been missions work in Africa for all this time? And I guess what did it look like?
Yes. First of all, Alexandria, of course, was a Hellenistic, primarily Greek-speaking city, part of the Roman and Hellenistic world. Mm-hmm. But from Alexandria, Christianity quickly spread among the ordinary Egyptians, whom today we know as Copts. And 3 of the earliest Bible translations were into 3 different Coptic dialects that were spoken in different parts of Egypt. And so if you've read about Antony the Great, the founder of monasticism, which has been so important throughout European Christian history, he was an African villager. I mean, he was a Copt. He wasn't, he wasn't Hellenistic at all. He didn't speak Greek, or if he spoke, he probably understood some Greek, but he mostly didn't speak it. We know that Athanasius spoke Coptic, and he spoke Coptic, whenever he, hung out with Antony because they knew each other. Early on, of course, in Acts, we see, the so-called Ethiopian eunuch. First of all, the Greek word Ethiopian basically means Black Africa. It doesn't mean the area that we know as Ethiopia and Eritrea today. And it primarily referred to what today is Sudan and South Sudan. Secondarily, it referred to the rest of Black Africa, including what's now Ethiopia today. And so in the first century, there was a present in Nubia. He was from, Candace is not a woman's name. Kandake is a regnal title of a Nubian queen whose seat of government was at the city of Meroe, which is right on the Nile in what's now Sudan. And so there was an early Christian presence while the apostles were still alive. Now that kingdom, a couple hundred years later, got destroyed. And then there was kind of chaos for a while before kingdoms began to recoalesce. And so in Nubia, there was an initial start, and then there was kind of a stop. You had a Christian presence, just from traders, merchants who would travel in what's now Eritrea and northern Ethiopia, and also Yemen, very early on among the Jewish community, and even Christians among the local Axumites, who were the ancestors of the modern Ethiopians. That didn't really take off and become firmly established until the time of Athanasius. 2 boys were traveling with their uncle, got shipwrecked. The uncle was killed. The boys were kidnapped as slaves. Frumentius and Admentius, and they basically became very important in the administration of the kingdom after the king died, helping the queen mother while her son Azana was still too young. When he became king, they were allowed to go back home. Frumentius didn't go all the way back home to Lebanon. He went to see Athanasius. Hey, the church is growing down in Aksum, what we think of Ethiopia and Eritrea today. You should send a bishop to help it be organized. And Athanasius says, who would be better than you? And so he sent Frumentius back. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church acknowledges Frumentius as, kind of the equivalent of their first pope, even though he was Lebanese ethnically. And so from the time of Athanasius, there's been a continuous Ethiopian Christianity without a break. It's had low points and it's had high points. Nubian Christianity began to get reestablished slowly in the 300s and 400s. In the 500s and 600s, it really took off in what's now Sudan. And Nubian Christianity had 1,000-year history before they succumbed to climate change, the encroaching Sahara Desert, and forces from particularly from the Muslim Arabs and the Muslim Mamluk Turks, who were by then ruling Egypt. But the Nubian Christian army were the first people who stopped the Islamic advance. When Rome fell, the eastern provinces of Rome, Israel, Jordan, Syria, fell immediately. Egypt fell immediately. They turned south to head down towards what's now Ethiopia. They hit the border of Nubia or Sudan, and the Nubian Christian soldiers stopped them cold. And they continued to be independent for 1,000 years before they were finally, swept away in the vicissitudes of history. Now, before they disappeared, there was Nubian Christian presence on both sides of Lake Chad, which, is pretty far inland from the Nile. And there's archaeological evidence of Christian presence in what is now Mali and Nigeria in the 1400s and 1500s, before the Portuguese, began to explore the areas in the so-called European Age of Discovery. Also, in the 500s, the Byzantine Church was so excited about how well things were going in Aksum that they sent some missionaries further inland into what's now Uganda or Congo, probably. But the surviving data on that and what happened to that work is really lost to us. Then in the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s, the Kingdom of Congo, in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, and Congo Brazzaville, was a Christian kingdom. 1400s, late 1400s, all the 1500s and the 1600s, before the European slave trade broke its back. And consequently, a lot of the African captives who were taken to North American shores were Congolese Christians. And they impacted the growth of Christianity among the African American population. And during the revivals of the Great Awakening, Congolese Christian practices influenced the Great Awakening to the extent that a lot of things that we think of as just kind of revivalistic, evangelical, white evangelical today, is the gift of Congolese Christianity from the Congolese Christians who were illegally and wrongfully and sinfully enslaved in the Commonwealth of Virginia, among other places. Mm-hmm. Well, a colony of Virginia, not yet a Commonwealth then. History of Christianity in Africa is my favorite topic, so I tried really hard to be short.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
As soon as you asked that question, I was like, we're going to be here for a while.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering.
No, it's a good question. It's a good question. I think we have time for one more, if there's one more question.
I do have another one if no one else, but I'll let someone else.
Okay, let's go for it, Nick.
All right. So, oh gosh, my mind just went blank. Okay. Well, never mind.
Well, like I said, Joshua and I are friends. So if you do have questions that come up in the next, couple of days or something, I can send them to him, and he can answer them for us that way. So
Yeah, that'd be great.
The question.
cool. So okay, well, can we say thank you?
Yes,
Thank you.
Yeah. You are the man, sir.
Ashe Tentai. Thanks
I'm sorry?
to y'all.
What's that?
Ashe Tentai. Thanks also to y'all.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, that'll take care of it. Thanks, guys. Joshua, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So, all right. See you guys next time.